What if I told you you can use this to remember anything in A-level economics? If you're new around here, my name is Nevin. I'm a first class economist and I help A-level economics students get A stars. We've already talked about how A-level economics is a uniquely difficult A-level because it combines the three elements of exam content mastery, excellent time management, and exam technique. So I want to give you tips and tricks to ensure that you can remember everything you're taught in A-level economics because it's already difficult enough. There's always two parts to indenting something into your long-term memory. There's learning and there's application. So the learning bit comes from you in the school, in the classroom, when your teacher's going through PPFs, supply and demand, indirect taxes, subsidies, and then in macro, you've got ADAS diagrams. Then the application bit comes from yourself and actually modeling these changes on graphs yourself. Where most students fail is that they try and memorize the graphs in A-level economics. But memorizing does not indent these graphs into your long-term memory. What does indent these graphs into your long-term memory is actually understanding all the curves. If you're able to understand and fully interpret what these curves represent, then you don't need to memorize the diagrams, you fully understand them. That is what ingrains these diagrams into your long-term memory. So when you're presented with a brand new problem and an unfamiliar shift of a graph in your economics exam, you can apply the knowledge that you have correctly. So for example, every diagram that you're taught in A-level economics, I want you to actually really think about what the curves and shifts are showing you. So if we literally just start off with our basic demand and supply curve, this is our microeconomics 101 that everyone knows. But you actually do not need to memorize what happens to this diagram if you actually understand what the curves show. So let's take the supply and demand diagram. Let's start off with the demand curve. The law of demand is the law of diminishing marginal utility, and it states that each additional unit of a good consumed will result in lower and lower satisfaction and welfare that consumers experience. Think about yourself. You probably use your phone every day, right? How much utility would you get from having an additional phone? Probably not as much as the utility you got from your first phone, right? How about a third and fourth phone? At that point, it just becomes redundant having and acquiring more phones, right? And this is exactly what the law of diminishing marginal utility is, the law of demand. So if you're able to understand that and you understand that the demand curve shows marginal utility of consumers, you're able to understand what consumer surplus means, and you're able to understand how consumers are affected when anything shifts in the diagram. Similarly with supply, you know that the supply curve is upward sloping because it represents the marginal cost curve, and it is because the profit motive for firms. Again, similarly, if you understand that, you know that despite whatever shift you're presented with in the diagram, you can model it accurately, use the SPEQ acronym, and as well as that, you're able to analyze the effects that it has on producer surplus for firms. So through that very simple exercise, hopefully with supply and demand, you can now see that if you're able to truly understand the curves, i.e. the demand curve is a measure of utility and the supply curve is marginal cost, you can model and analyze whatever you need for any exam situation. If we take a look at theme 3, year 13 microeconomics, and we look at the cost curves, for example, our average cost curve and our marginal cost curves, you have to ask yourself, why are they U-shaped? Why are they shaped the way they are? And it is because of diminishing marginal returns, i.e. when you add variable factors of production to a stock of fixed factors of production, output will initially rise, but then it will fall. Additionally, you know your average revenue is your demand curve and that the marginal revenue is twice as steep as your average revenue curve. Can you see how through these very little exercises you're able to understand what each of the curves actually represent and are? Not only will that take your analysis to another level, but it will help you so much in actually trying to remember everything you're taught in A-level economics, because you're actively applying whilst learning, which is what ingrains this in your long-term memory. So next time you're looking at diagrams in A-level economics, I want you to actually look and consider what the curves represent and how any shifts or changes in the diagram would affect the curves. And you can cover off all your key points and diagrams of the spec right here. Go through the spec and revise with the spec to aid your revision and to remember everything to indent it into your long-term memory. If you found this video helpful and you are on your way to getting an A star in A-level economics, I want you to check out my essay structure guide. Here I break down the watermelons leak acronym, the Celesta acronym for evaluation, so you know how to do A star analysis and you know A star evaluation, and I show you how to come up with a well-informed judgment to impress the examiner. So check it out and I'll catch you next time.